The bullet cracked past Elias Thorne's ear, so close he felt the heat of it splintering the cedar post he'd been leaning against at dawn. He dropped the coffee mug, rolled off the porch, and came up with the Winchester already in his hands. Through the haze of gun smoke he saw them 12, maybe 15, Apache riders circling his little cabin on the high bench above the San Simon Valley, their faces streaked with vermilion and black lances glinting like cruel stars in the first light. War party, it's no question. He had time for one cold thought before the arrows started to hiss. Yesterday, I fixed a woman's wagon. Today they've come to kill me for it. 24 hours earlier, the wind had been gentler, carrying the smell of creosote and sun-scorched pine instead of powder smoke. Elias had been riding the ridgeline checking his scraggly herd when he spotted the broken wagon far below. One wheel shattered, the canvas flapping like a wounded bird. A single figure wrestled with an axle while two small children clung to her skirts. Even from a distance, he knew she was Apache hair in long braids, calico dress the color of desert sand. The proud set of shoulders that belonged to a people who had never asked permission to cross these mountains. Most white men would have put spurs to their horse and pretended they saw nothing. Elias almost did. He had his own grief to carry 3 years since the Comanche arrow took Mary in the chest. 2 years since the fever took little Ruth, 1 year since the bottle had nearly taken what was left of him. Helping an Indian felt like borrowing trouble he couldn't afford. But the woman looked up then, shading her eyes against the white glare. And something in her face, defiance mixed with exhaustion, reached straight into the raw place he kept locked. He nudged his mare down the slope. She watched him come, one hand slipping to the knife at her belt. The children boy of maybe 8, girl no more than 5, pressed against her like frightened colts. "Afternoon, ma'am," Elias said, touching his hat brim. "Looks like you threw a wheel." She studied him the way a wolf studies, fire-wary, calculating. Her English was careful, edged with the music of the Chiricahua tongue. The iron tire split. "My husband is hunting meat. You have far to go before dark." Elias swung down. "Name's Thorne. I've got tools and a spare tire on my pack horse." Suspicion lingered in her dark eyes, but the little girl began to cry softly, and that settled it. She stepped aside. They worked together in the furnace heat. He jacked the wagon. She slid the new wheel into place, while the boy handed tools with solemn importance. Her name, she finally offered, was Sella. The children were Dakia and Nyeyes. Her husband, Jalinte, rode with a band that still refused the reservation at San Carlos. They were moving camp south before the soldiers came looking again. Elias didn't ask questions. He'd fought Apaches in '73, lost friends to them, buried his own under their arrows. But sweat and labor have a way of making two people human to each other. When the wagon stood whole again, Sella offered him water from a canteen beaded with woven willow. Their fingers brushed. Neither flinched. "You are not like the others," she said quietly. "Lost too much to hate proper anymore," he answered, surprising himself with the truth. She studied him a long moment, then reached into a pouch and pressed something small and hard into his palm, an old Spanish silver coin drilled for wearing. Strung on a rawhide cord. "For the wheel," she said, "for the kindness men say we do not deserve." He started to refuse, but the look in her eyes stopped him. He slipped it around his neck, under his shirt, where it rested cool against the scar tissue over his heart. They parted with few words. He watched the wagon roll south until it was a speck against the heat shimmer, then turned his mare toward home feeling lighter than he had in years. Now, crouched behind a rain barrel with lead snapping overhead, that lightness felt like a cruel joke. The first rush came fast ponies, screaming, lances lowered. Elias levered round after round, dropping 2 horses, but they were on him before he could reload fully. A warrior crashed through the door, war club raised. Elias parried with the rifle barrel, felt the shock up his arms, then drove his Bowie knife into the man's side to spare him only, to realize too late the warrior wore a familiar beaded band around his braids. Jalint, Sella's husband. The man's eyes widened in recognition, a heartbeat before Elias's blade found flesh. Jalinte staggered back, blood blooming across his chest, hatred and betrayal warring on his painted face. Outside, the shooting stopped as suddenly as it began. A woman's voice, sharp, commanding, cut through the smoke. "Enough," Sella stood in the yard astride a paint horse, children nowhere in sight, or a man's cartridge belt now, hair loose and wild. The warriors parted for her like grass before wind. Elias stepped onto the porch, knife dripping, chest heaving. Jolinte sagged against the wall inside, coughing red. Sella's gaze went from her dying husband to the white man who had killed him. Something ancient and terrible moved behind her eyes. "You," she said, voice raw, "you gave us a wheel. Now you take my heart." Elias had no defense. Words felt smaller than bullets. He came at me wearing war paint. "I didn't know you knew enough yesterday," she said. When you chose kindness, the warriors stirred, restless, waiting for the order to finish it. Elias set the rifle down slow, palms open. The silver coin burned against his skin like a brand. Sella dismounted. She walked past him into the cabin and knelt beside Jolinte. The big warrior tried to speak, managed only a wet rattle. She pressed her forehead to his, whispered something in Apache, too soft for Elias to catch. Then she closed his eyes with steady fingers and stood. Outside, the sun bled across the mountains, turning everything the color of old wounds. Sella faced the war party. "This man gave us life on the trail. Today he took one. The scales do not balance, but they are even enough. We ride." A low growl of protest rose. She silenced it with a look fierce enough to peel paint. "He wears the token I gave. That is my word on him. Any man who raises hand against him raises hand against me." No one moved. She turned to Elias last. Tears had cut pale channels through the dust on her cheeks, but her voice did not shake. "Live, cowboy. Live long enough to remember that kindness and killing can come from the same pair of hands. Carry that weight. It is the only payment I will ever ask." She swung up, wheeled her pony, and the riders followed her into the gathering dark. Ghosts quiet, leaving only hoofprints and the smell of blood. Elias buried Jolinte at sunset on the hill behind the cabin, wrapped in the dead man's own blanket, facing east the way Apaches like it. He left the war club and a canteen of water. No one would disturb an Apache grave up here, white or red. When the last shovelful of dirt was patted down, he sat against the raw mound and took out the silver coin. Moonlight glinted off the old Spanish milling. He thought of Mary laughing in the kitchen, of little Ruth chasing chickens, of a dark-eyed woman who had every reason to let him die and chose not to. Years later, travelers along the San Simon would speak of a solitary rancher who never turned anyone away, Mexican vaqueros, runaway slaves, Chinese railroad workers, even Apache families slipping north ahead of the soldiers. They said he kept no mirror in his house, that he worked from Kansi to Kansi. That on certain nights when the wind came down off the Chiricahuas, you could hear a man singing low to the coyote's voice cracked with whiskey and grief, and something fiercer than either. And if you looked close, beneath the weathered throat, you'd glimpse a flash of silver on rawhide, rising and falling with every stubborn breath, 'cause some debts can't be paid, only carried, and some kindnesses cut deeper than any knife.